Welcome to the AT series, Closer Look at Access. Today's session is called A Closer Look at Seating and Mobility as it relates to the use of AT within an activity. Today's content is part 2 in a 2-part webinar pairing and is also the third webinar in this 5-part series. My name is Tammy Thompson-Cook and I am an educational consultant at Patent, and I'll be monitoring the questions in the chat window throughout the sessions. We at Patent are so pleased to be working with Karen and having her present on such an important topic, and have greatly appreciated all the collaboration and guidance that she's provided to our many intermediate unit assistive technology consultants who support the assistive technology needs across the state of Pennsylvania. And with that, I'm going to have Karen introduce herself and get us started.
Hello, everyone. I hope you've been having a good day. This hour goes by really fast. For those of you, just as a quick reminder, the first part of the session of this 5-week series, we really look at historically how access was looked at. And just as a reminder, it was looked at because access and assistive technology were originally developed for adults. So often when you looked at assessment of what device should I use, if I'm going to look at AAC or I'm going to look at computer access, everybody starts with access first. What I'm trying to help you with is to understand that's not what we do with children. Children who have not yet had experiences with a lot of activity, much less all the other things that school entails, I want you to understand that access is a lot bigger than that. So last week, we talked directly about the students' bodies, and we particularly talked about kids with complex body issues. Because they often are frequently the ones that people are the most challenged with finding them access. We're going to continue on that line today, but we're going to talk a lot more about activity directly relating to this access. In the next 2 following weeks is when we're going to specifically look at those different kinds of techniques and how we get involved. So I invite you all there. Today, though, I really wanted to talk a great deal about task engagement. And I wanted to say how we determine task engagement. A lot of times people will say to me that, again, they're worried their students aren't, in quotes, motivated to pay attention, and are easily distractible. Instead, what I'm hoping that you'll begin to learn is that our ability to be engaged in a task is dependent upon a lot of things. Obviously, the first thing is their interest in the activity. And generally, how we interest children in activity is about the activity itself and how we've created it in the environment to allow them to easily interact with it. We talked last week, I hope, how important it is that we help our students have an opportunity of active seating with pelvic weight bearing. And that really sets up the body by saying to the body, we're going to get engaged in an activity, you're interested. And pelvic weight bearing and active seating is a demonstration of interest. And it is how the body, all Homo sapiens on planet Earth, how our body moves as it moves toward an activity, how it sits down a seat and moves toward an activity, how it sets up visual convergence, visual focus automatically, and then how it assists in that task engagement. The next thing is that we're going to talk a little bit more about today and through the next 3 times is that how we stay engaged in an activity is by having a knowledge of what that task actually entails. And that requires that we understand and can anticipate what the beginning, middle, and end of an activity is. In other words, the way we start to demonstrate extended task engagement that includes task performance or task interaction requires that we develop a neuronal pathway for that task. That means that we literally build a shortcut in our brain, a pathway to that math homework page, a pathway to that math homework page when we work on it at home, that path on that homework page that we work on when we're in school, and there's a pathway for a homework page if we worked into it in a study hall if we were in middle school. So the way we develop competency and mastery is neurologically. And we develop those shortcuts by the basis of us understanding and being able to anticipate the beginning, middle, and end of an activity. And that beginning, middle, and end may surprise you. It's not the beginning of the activity for reading, for instance, is not the first page of a book. The beginning of the activity is where are you reading that book and how is your body ready? And how does the body know that it's ready and coming to that position to begin the activity? The middle part of beginning, middle, and end is actually reading. And the end is what is the transition when the activity is over and how do you get prepared for what happens next? So actually beginning, middle, and end of the activity includes the transitioning into whatever that activity is and the transition out of. Now, this is one place where transition, I want people to understand how important transitions are. And we know from people, although we've not spent a whole lot of focus on kids on the spectrum, we all know that they also, a big challenge for teachers is looking at transition. How can they anticipate what's about to happen next? And this same thing is very true of looking at any child. All of us and any of us, if we just went to a conference and we went into an open room and there weren't even tables or chairs there, we would immediately start wondering, I don't even know what I'm supposed to do. What's happening? I thought this conference was that I was coming in to listen to a speaker. But as soon as we see tables and chairs, we immediately know to sit down, find our place. We pull out a work, we pull out a tablet, a pencil, or we may pull out our laptop. We know how to behave when we go to a conference, and that ability to understand that anticipation gives us the precursor to being able to pay attention. Now, last week, we talked a lot about the seating themselves, and I'm going to do just a very quick reminder. You guys can go back and play that over again because we've got so much to cover today. But we talked about the seating for postural management, which is unfortunately most of the seating that your children are in all day. And that's what has to change. This is appropriate seating for safe travel on the bus. It is passive seating. It is not active. It also is appropriate for children who are being fed, and also for when they want to rest. But we need to find opportunities that we are providing seating for postural control. So the children need to be engaged, and that requires some independent control of movement. How do we support pelvic stability, which is control of movement, utilizing weight bearing, especially at the pelvis, again, supporting that visual convergence. And even if you're working with a kid who has cerebral CVI, it doesn't mean that we don't want to support visual convergence. We still want to put the body in positions that all bodies need to be in to say my eyes are going to be facing forward. Because when children have CVI, that means they have processing problems. So it doesn't mean we're going to ignore their eyes. We instead want to help them really understand how to focus in terms of an activity. Okay, so we're not looking now at symmetrical or 90-90 positions. And today we'll talk a little bit more about exploring that when we're trying to look at how we actually can set up activities. Okay, so the things you want to remember that we want to try and create is that the pelvis is weight bearing, the head is in front of the shoulders, the body's upright, all parts of the body are not in contact with the surface of the seating. And these positions need to be paired with activity and experience over time. This isn't a single position, but it allows for movement through positions and within positions. Okay, so one of the most important things that I want to talk about as we start dealing with access is that we unfortunately are testing for access instead of teaching within activity. And what I want to tell you is, again, let's use an anecdote. When we have a very young child and we want to give them an opportunity to color or to write, at first they scribble. We recognize that. They may use a marker. They may want to use your pen. They may want to use a pencil. They may use fat crayons. But as they reach 3, even so they may not be able to form letters, they will do things at times that come up to you and say, I have a grocery list. They'll actually tell you that. And you can see that they're understanding something happens on the paper and I'm holding something, but they're figuring out access and activity. And they know there's a relationship, but it does not look anything close to letters. Somehow we've forgotten that when we start looking at kids who are going to be using assistive technology, who have inexperienced bodies and complex bodies, who can't naturally pick up a pencil, or their hands don't immediately work well for them to just point and touch and manipulate objects. And so we immediately start throwing things at them, and we then start counting if they consistently do something 8 out of 10 times. And we literally say, can you hit the switch? Did you hit the switch 8 out of 10 times? And people say to me all the time, well, he's not consistent with switch access use. Well, a switch is not an activity. A switch is controlling something, and that control of something, by the way, when somebody says, I want him to use the computer, that's not helpful either. Telling me I want to use the computer for what? When people say to me that they have, oh, I want to do cause and effect software and I want them to match yellow. Okay, well, I'm saying, first of all, that you are making a presumption that cause and effect software are teaching switch access, which is not necessarily true. We've gotten so sidetracked by believing that our children do not understand that they're using an alternative way to access an activity. What I want to tell you is, if the activity is interesting and their body is in a position to be engaged, and we have created an opportunity for learning, this cause and effect is totally sidetracking. What we are really doing in all of the activities that you're looking for is you're just doing behavior modification, stimulus response shaping. Stimulus response shaping is not going to help you develop language. We want children to use a communication device. And I also, I want to, even when I'm typing, I am an extremely good typist. I made extra money when I was in college typing people's, at that time we didn't have computers, we didn't have word processors. I used to type people's thesis. Why? Because I could do it fast and accurately. Why? Because I was copying. I wasn't engaged in the activity. I was simply copying. So when we started getting excited, when people used to give you, when you used to go for a job interview and somebody'd say, well, what's your typing speed? Well, that's because you were a secretary copied already written work. That's not what we do now. When I'm creating a document, when I'm creating a PowerPoint, my fast speed of typing doesn't help. I can still make mistakes because I am doing an activity. And access varies with the activity, not only the familiarity of the activity, but what the focus cognitively is in that activity. And when our children are going to be speaking with a communication device, we're hoping that they're going to have novel language. They're not just looking up simple greetings or saying goodbye or saying my favorite color is yellow. So we've gotten totally hung up on this whole causality. And I want you to understand, there is not a child born who doesn't have cause and effect. Causality then, as it relates to everything else in the gradient of learning, and how we actually develop it through Piagetian accommodation and then assimilation, and then are able to generalize and then go from concrete operations to not concrete operations. That is not that same cause and effect. And so when you are counting switch hits, you have lost the beauty of an activity. And I want to tell you, using a switch is like learning to play the piano or a musical instrument. There are going to be mistakes, but you must learn it as a part of the activity, not separately. Me separately being able to hit a switch 8 out of 10 times is like you telling me that I can play a song by using my index finger on middle C, and you're going to measure how quickly I release it and touch it so many times in a row. That's not going to get a song out of me. So we are totally hung up on testing. We aren't doing teaching. If you're looking at 8 out of 10 times, you're not teaching. People then say to me all the time, well, how am I going to do measurable outcomes? Well, I will talk to you a whole lot about that later, but deciding to test someone and then pronounce them as failing at using switch access when you have not even identified how the activity relates to learning, how it relates to that individual child. And that's what I really want to talk about. So teaching requires much more experience. And if you are in fact going to use counting actions as a measurement, so 8 out of 10 times, then you must be able to identify what the actual motor acts are in relationship to the activity. And you need to identify the activity, not just this. And you must be starting out with a baseline of at least 1,000 acts. Because we now know that even developing motor competence. So if we want to even talk about an 18-month-old being able to perform a pincer grasp, which they can do, they cannot do all day long and in every situation. But we know that before they actually are able to take that pincer grasp and manage almost anything that comes their way, that doesn't happen until they're 5 years old. So they've been doing that from 18 months to 5-year-olds. And the reason I'm going to say that is because your 2-year-old and 3-year-old very easily can say, I need your help, mommy. Okay, there are many of us that also say not only our pincer grasp, but our own grasp. We joke that we have to ask somebody to open our pickle jars. So what I wanted to say is that comes from millions of opportunities, millions of attempts. And that's one of the biggest problems about kids who have had an interruption in their development and are left with a body that doesn't allow them to manipulate objects on their own, they have then a very limited repertoire of personal experience. And when you then take that very tiny, small amount and attempt to make a judgment across it, then you haven't really understood what has to happen. So we need to be engaged in activity that allow children, if you're going to do that kind of counting, it can't be counted on less than at least 1,000 attempts. And then you can start to tell me what percentage of that. And that kind of gives you an idea of how crazy the counting is. Instead, what I want to talk to you about, let me give you an example. Everybody loves to talk about their kids into toilet training. And I hate the word toilet training. I would rather call it toilet mastery, because when somebody says, oh, my kid was toilet trained early, I don't know what that means. It may mean that, in fact, your kid, does that mean that your kid actually got their diaper out? Is it that they let you know they had to go, or is it that they ran to the bathroom? Or does it mean simply when you put them on the potty, they went? Okay, so a first signal, just going on the potty and when you put them there, it is not toilet mastery. And them also then letting you know they have to go, that's one step. But toilet mastery includes being able to not only feel it, but get to the toilet yourself, take your pants down, go finish, know when you're finished, be able to wipe yourself, pull your clothes back on, and wash your hands. That's toilet mastery. That no one has toilet mastery early. Everybody has some parts of toileting interest early. And you have, from some of the earliest kids who have toileting interest, they may shift and they may actually be okay. And then you'll have 6 months where all of a sudden it seems like they're having accidents again. Because what happened is they got really fascinated with this whole idea. Then when they kind of started realizing, wow, there's so many other things I'm going to do, is they got so involved in activity that they forgot they had to go and could still have some accidents. We also know that if a child is in an environment that's not very structured or predictable, toilet mastery can really be a problem. We know that toilet mastery is all of those things. And we know that usually that happens, toilet mastery happens at home. And when we then have to go to grandma's house, or if we go to Disney World, or if we go to an amusement park, or we go for a summer out day, if mom hasn't frequently given the child opportunities to go to the bathroom, there may be accidents. Okay, so I'm all about toilet mastery. So when I'm talking to you about activity, that's what I mean. I want our children engaged in a whole activity. I don't care that you did 8 out of 10 switch hits with a kid turning a page on the computer, because first of all, that's really boring. And turning the page on a computer to read a story, many, many people say to me, well, that's what I gave as an activity. I thought they'd be interested. I'm here to tell you right now, it is not very interesting to turn a page in a book when you're not a reader. It can be a little bit, but it is fun to help. It is fun to be able to take a turn turning the page if I'm reading the story with you, but not just to be put in front of a computer and turn a page, not for an initial activity. The younger the child, the less experienced the child is with not only activity in school, the vital importance it is for those of us who are teachers to be with them and make that activity increasingly exciting. And in addition to that, we want to get their peers involved. Our children have very little experience with group activity. Okay? So I want us to remember that the journey to competence and mastery of AAC is not by finding an access technique. That's not what the competence and mastery of AAC is. Instead, you have to understand it is in fact a journey, and it has to be used throughout the day in all activities. Here, I want you to think about the idea of signing. If I took away every kid's wheelchair and all I did was give you a whole group of deaf kids, what would be the thing that we would start doing with them as they were little? We would be signing all day long, and we wouldn't stop talking, and some of them would learn it faster than others, but we certainly wouldn't be counting, did they perform more correctly 8 out of 10 times? That's not how a kid learns sign. Instead, what we're looking at is, do they attempt it? Do they try it? Do they do it with me? How do they do it with the different activities that we're involved in? Who are they speaking the most with? How are they understanding talking with each other? So I want you, an AAC device is no different than learning sign language or learning any kind of language. It incorporates a relationship, and not only with the person, but also now we're asking for someone to navigate a machine. Okay, so the next thing that has to happen is we have to be modeling it. And we have to be modeling it by our adults using it. So at least in a sign situation, we're signing and the kid is signing. If we're teaching English as a second language, we're speaking a different language. We all know that we learn language by immersion. Now, we don't learn language necessarily by modeling. We do learn how it makes sense. We practice that way. But a lot of times people think that just modeling tells you, role modeling is telling somebody what to say at what times. And that's not really true, because we know that children pick up language in different ways. And I hope none of us adults are saying me, mine now. And most of us have never said she did that yesterday. Okay, so our kids, when they're playing with past tense, they use different words. But the modeling that's important, and particularly is important, is that we know that if children are being taught to read, we know from science the one attribute, we can argue all day long about phonics or whether I want to do this or a whole language approach, but we do know one thing. If children are read to, that is one of the biggest predictors of a future reader, is that children have been read to. So they live in a rich environment of being read to and read with. That is the biggest predictor of a future reader. Well, that is because that's the kind of modeling we need. The modeling is, I can read, but I'm with you. I'm not doing it showing you. I'm not showing you to do it. I'm instead saying, you're with me. And when we're together, this is how we read. So we need to be, I still do not see frequent use of AAC in our environments by the adults around. And that's everybody, not just the paraprofessional, but the OTs and PTs. You know, we would be learning sign with a deaf kid. I do not understand. We haven't practiced that. And then we certainly are not helping our same age peers practicing that. One of the ways I love to do that is through social scripting, which is also a teaching strategy for learning to use an AAC device. And that is that you literally create a little social script of turn taking. And when it first started out, when I first learned about it and people were practicing, they were practicing conversation, much like when you're learning a second language, that we're playing these different parts. Hi, how are you? How much does it cost for me to buy a hamburger? Blah, blah, blah. I like to make social scripting for very young children. I like to act out a play environment. So I like to have switch toys in a story, and we're going to act out part of the story. So the switch toys are going to act out a part of a story that we read. And we can have some of those phrases pre-programmed into devices, and we can have every child use a device, or two children use devices, even a speaking child, and not have somebody else be speaking. Or we can have the puppet. A puppet can use one of the devices with the child using their voice and an adult doing that. I then, as we start moving into older age elementary school and middle school, we always automatically in literature, we do plays. We do plays even when kids are really young. We learn lines. Well, now we can literally have some practice plays. Let's read a story. Let's read a play. Let's make it simpler, and let's act out. Let's be different characters. And in the different characters this time, we're going to act them out, and our roles will be using an AAC device. Okay, I'm here to tell you, same age peers love this. They are already embraced technology, helping them do that. And so what's great now, all of a sudden, they're going to make mistakes too. But our children are going to say, it's not just me doing something always differently. Now we're actually having a short activity that everybody is engaged, and we're using the same method of access. So AAC, and I then want you to understand that an AAC device, which by the way, is also a computer for writing, is an augmentative device, requires the knowledge of how the machine works and how the machine is navigated, and then what software is being used inside that, and then how to get at it, and then how to use it anytime that I want to. That is a whole lot of information. As I said to you before, and I'll say a lot, a 6-month-old baby will grab your phone and start to poke at it and hold it up to their ear or try and speak into it because they've seen you do that. They can't dial a number though. They can't find the app that they want unless we somehow make it extremely simple and we teach them literally where the navigation is, what page it's on, how you go to get it. We teach that. And one of the ways that we develop the ability to understand navigation is our ability to cognitively map our environment. That means that I know by mobility, by independent mobility, my environment. I know when I come in the front door, I enter a little foyer before, and then that enters us into the living room. But if I come in the back door, I'm into the kitchen or into the garage. And I know from the garage where that next place is. Well, children learn that and have a map inside their head, then develop a cognitive map of where these associations are. They learn with that cognitive map what objects tend to live there. And they do that by mobility. Well, think about our kids. They don't have mobility. So they don't have mobility. How have we stressed or encouraged them to develop cognitive mapping? How have we helped them recognize navigation? Okay, so that's why I'm teaching you this. All of this directly relates to how our children will be able to use Access. Okay. The next thing I want to gripe a little bit about, I hate starting out with some of these negative things, but it happens all the time. I don't want us to test Access. And the next thing is, I don't want to trial an Access technique to see if this is the one. Okay. Instead, what I want you to recognize is that our children don't need the one. They instead need experience with multiple issues of access. We want all our children to have a lot of experience with a lot of methods of access. And when we increase their repertoire of experience, including inactivity, we and they together can then say, do you know what? I would like to use eye gaze on an on-screen keyboard to write a couple sentences. Or no, I'd really like to use scanning to do that. How can we trial an access technique, and why are you looking for one? Again, this is falling back to the history of traditional access assessment for an adult like my sister who has ALS, who is weak, whose whole body doesn't work. You clearly are picking an access point that's going to tire out. You may have to have a couple for someone with ALS because they don't have it. Or you may be looking at someone who has a high level spinal cord injury, and they're going to tell you they only have some head movement or some face movement. And so how are you going to help them do that? That's not true of children. Our children need experience to manage different things. So I want to say, we need to be using access techniques very purposefully throughout the day during activities in our classroom. We need to also then identify that we're going to do a different kind of, we're going to use a specific kind of access technique for a particular activity. We all eye gaze, but we are not good at necessarily eye gazing on a computer. All people, all the manufacturers of eye gaze will tell you, oh, this is really easy. You don't do 18 inches apart, calibrate it for where your eyes are, see the little bubble, pop the bubble, or move this over here. That's not writing a sentence. And I want to say to all of you who are teaching children using alternative access, means you have to learn it. You have to do it. So the first time you sit down at eye gaze, you are all writers. I want you to write a paragraph. I want 5 sentences, and I want no sentence less than 5 words. I don't care if it's a simple one. If my name is Karen Marie Kangas, I live at 1 Beaver Road, Camp Hill, Pennsylvania, that's okay. Or it can be that you want to make some philosophical saying, or it may want to be like a journal. You're going to find out it is not as easy as you think, and you already read, you already have composed paragraphs, you already have a hugely experienced body. Because it's not the same as looking at something. But if I'm with you and I happen to be in the library and we have to be very quiet and you're my really closest friend and we're looking for something specific, I can tap you and look at something, and I can do such a direct eye gaze, it's very clear that you know what I want to do. So we need to be saying, okay, right now in the classroom, in this little activity, we're going to all eye gaze our answers and no one's going to talk. And I like to turn on a timer. It's going to happen for 5 minutes. This could be some of your morning circle time activities where you're looking at who's going to be able, what date is it, what time it is. And it can be fun for everybody, but we want to say, this is how we're going to do something. You can also use single switch access to manage the left click of a mouse. Very, very easy to have a switch adapted mouse, and very easy that everybody who uses that mouse is going to be using the click, is going to be, instead of using the click on the mouse, is going to use a switch to do the click. We can use multiple step-by-steps. Those are those little communication devices that we digitize, we put in a sentence. And I like to say, I hope that we are using those as augmentative devices for augmentative devices, meaning all of our kids should have those. All of our kids should have those with several phrases that say, I need some help. It's my turn now. I have a question for you. Or could you get my communication device out? Or could you get out my language board? Our kids should all be having those as attention getters, which I'm not seeing either. But we also we could use those as a recording on those, and we could have a board game that we've made, because every kid loves to roll the dice in a board game. And we are very used to having very wonderful experienced teachers who don't just bring in board games for the board game's sake. I mean, it's not that we can't learn math from board game's sake, but they make the idea of a board game into a spelling game, or it can be a math game that they're using. And it's not very exciting to have a bowl that has dice in it. You have a switch that you touch and you just get to see them go around. But if you had the step-by-steps and we had all the kids standing, so I could have my kid in a stander or in their walker, and we could have them, so now they could use their hands and they could wind up and try and hit the step-by-step. The step-by-step now would say randomly dice roll. So it could say 2 + 2, or it could say 4 + 3, or it could say double sixes, however you wanted. And now that's how the game would be played by everyone. So everyone would be touching that and interpreting that. So again, same age peers totally can get into this. And then you're going to have even more extensive modeling of we can all do things in different ways and they still be actively engaged in the activity. And it doesn't mean the activity has to be compromised. Okay. When we deal with teaching and not testing, one of the most important things we must learn to observe is we must learn to someone's not muted. There we go. We need to really observe carefully, and if you're not used to it, I'm hearing like a reverberation. Tammy,
Yeah,
can you hear that?
I'm texting our IT person in the background.
Okay, I'll back up a little bit and see if that helps. Anyway, all right, so what we need to do is we need to observe the thing that I want you to be concerned about is not a motor error as much as a cognitive error. And a lot of times to be able to do that, you need to record your sessions so you can learn to observe that with an individual child. I want our children to have tons of experience. And when you are using switch access or eye gaze, any alternative method. Well, I don't even care if you were using a keyboard. If I had a kid using a keyboard and I looked at their keyboarding skills, they'd be like making a lot of motor mistakes there too. What I'm interested in though, is are they making cognitive errors? So what we do in school is a lot of times it's in math class, the reason you did 50 problems, it wasn't because it took 50 problems for you to learn a particular theorem or math function, but 50 allowed the adult to look over it and they could start to get a sense of what mistakes you were making if you made mistakes. And they could then start to realize, was that a cognitive error? They'll see erasures, but they're starting to say, okay, what is not cognitively sound here in those 50 mistakes? If you're only asking a kid to do something simple and they only have 4 selections on a communication device and you're counting 8 out of 10 times, you're not going to have any idea whether they've made a motor error or a cognitive error. So what are motor errors? I expect there to be a lot of motor errors. The younger the child, the less experienced the child, or when somebody's tired. How about you? Do you ever make mistakes? Do you make mistakes when you're typing? Do you make mistakes when you're texting? Do you make mistakes when you're calling? Do you make mistakes with any of the technology that you have? Yes, 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 and yes. And if I all of a sudden said, okay, I want you to do it carefully, I'm going to time you and test you, could you still make mistakes? Yes. What I'm interested in though, is I'm not the motor mistake, but the cognitive error. So that means, did you choose the wrong page? Did you get in the wrong communication category? Did you not know the navigation? And then did you not recognize what you were intending to do? So how do we start? I want you to begin to start thinking every activity that you're involved in, what motor errors might occur versus cognitive ones. So what are the cognitive components of this activity? That's what I care about. What are the cognitive components? This is school after all. I want cognition. What is the cognitive content of this activity? And now when we're going to put some motor activity to it, those can be mistakes, but what I want to make sure is the child understands what the cognitive purpose is. Okay, so in order to do that, we really need to look at the physical configuration of our classrooms. And why is this so important to student activity and access? Because I'm hoping that you're going to start to understand you can't navigate without cognitive mapping. You can't understand cognitive mapping if you don't have that in your brain and you haven't used it and it hasn't developed. And by the way, cognitive mapping doesn't develop by you being passively pushed around or someone telling you, oh, did you know the bathroom is at the end of this hall? That doesn't help you. That's like if you aren't driving and you're in the passenger seat talking, you may not know where you went to get to somebody's house, but the driver has to know. One of the reasons why we've all become GPS dependent is it's very hard to go someplace new and still be a good driver and still get there. Okay, so this is the same thing. Access is so ingrained with activity that we have to recognize how are we supporting children to have opportunities to develop the same cognitive strategies that all children use when they themselves are not readily able to complete many of these tasks independently. Okay, so one of the things that's so important is that how do we manage an activity with limited space? So when I was talking about transition, when I talked last week about a child is ready for reading in a kindergarten classroom because the kindergarten teacher selects an area where she usually reads, that area is non-negotiable. And there usually are carpet squares that kids sit on. Kids go get the carpet square, put their butt down on it, and that's where they do reading. So by the time they've gotten the carpet square and sat and put their butt down on it, they're ready for the story. That's the beginning part of knowing what an activity is, for them to help be ready to learn to read, ready to listen. Okay, so in our classrooms where we have lots of equipment, and lots of adults, and we have limited space, how are our children knowing when we bring them to an activity? How do they know what that activity is going to be? And that's what I want you to understand. Traffic patterns are really important. And so when we, for instance, a very simple way to understand this is when I want to have a little more body engagement from any child. We live in Pennsylvania, so we have winters. So when it gets to be school time, you usually come to school with a jacket on. You may also have a lunch box. You may have boots, but we have to have some place where we put your coat. And when you come into the classroom to be ready, we first put your coat someplace. Well, when our kids are really involved and they have a paraprofessional, a lot of times that coat is removed anywhere the paraprofessional stops you. Your classroom may be busy. They sometimes outside, sometimes outside the door. It might be in the hallway, it might be right. I mean, just wherever they land, somebody kind of takes their coat off. If instead we went to an identified spot where her coat hung, and every time we did, we went there and then we removed the coat. As we went to that site, the child now knows when I get to that site, my coat is coming off. Well, guess what? At the end of the day, when I go to that site, I know my coat is going on. So I also know I'm getting ready to go home. So when you take me to that site, I know that's there. Very important for kids on the spectrum. Where do I hang my coat? Then where do I go after my coat is hung? We don't do that frequently in our classrooms for kids who are in self-contained classrooms or where there are multiple wheelchairs because the space is limited. We use one primary multi-activity table and the child has no idea at that as they're approaching that. Is it lunchtime? Is it this? What am I doing? All right. And we have no established traffic patterns. So if you go into any kindergarten classroom, first grade classroom, second grade classroom, you go into a middle school, by me going to the doorway of a classroom and me starting to walk in, I can, from the traffic pattern, determine what's expected of my behavior and probably what class is taught in that room. Labs look different than art rooms, not just because they have other things, but how they're set up, how they're expected to be. We must establish traffic patterns so the child knows when I go over to this part, this is where we read a story. When I come over to this part, this is where lunch happens. When I go over here. So we're going to talk a little bit how we analyze and how we can plan. You see right there is a motor mistake, how we plan or change this. I do want to say that the number of bodies and equipment in the room is really overwhelming, honestly. Now that we have paraprofessionals that are almost with every kid every time, and how are we actually helping that? Let's get a little more involved in that. Before I talk a little bit more about that, I just want to identify what all the physical configurations are that affect activity and access. Okay, so the actual mobility of the student within the classroom also affects it. So mobility is not just ambulation. Mobility means movement, and movement in the body is extremely important. When I talked to you last week about this, how we get in a task engaged position, my moving my body towards the book is getting me ready to pay attention to listening to that book. So altering the student's position and the seating equipment makes a huge difference. Well, right now, almost all of our kids and ambulation PTs, I hope you're listening, teachers, I hope you're listening, we are putting our kids and having them go walk in the hall. And we are not using it as an opportunity for are they not in their walkers to walk from one traffic zone, one zone in the room to another? Why aren't we building in the mobility for them to be able to get from one position to another and be then in that walking, in that frame to be engaged in activity there? Okay, so we need to have, our children need time to experience movement to an activity. Now, that doesn't mean that every kid can be in all the walkers to get to all activities or all power chairs, which of course I would adore if we actually had that. And it doesn't mean it has to happen every day, but it has to happen regularly. So what I'm trying to say is, beside your kid walking down the hall, and I myself, I'm an OT, I don't want a kid just walking down a hall, and I don't want you just measuring how far they walked and then say that's what their goal in their IEP was. How about we instead say we went to the library and picked up a book? So our goal is we're going out and going to the library to pick up a book. And if they can't walk that far, then you're going to bring the walker and them close to the library. And so then you're going to transfer them to the walker to go to the library and generally extend that. So they start to learn, where's the library in association to my classroom? They may also do it to get into the cafeteria, places that we're going to be. How do I get lined up to go for the bus? How am I going to do? So we start giving children opportunities with their mobility. Again, doesn't need to happen every day, but shouldn't be happening once a month. So you could be adding, as PTs and OTs become more involved in understanding, this is underlying how we deal with not only access and activity, we also develop vocabulary. So the language of where things are and how they're associated supports this cognitive mapping, which supports navigation, which then allows me to say, when I have an access technique, I now know what to do with it, as opposed to that I'm just going to hit a switch. Okay, so we need to really recognize how we approach an activity and how we leave an activity. And if our children have opportunities to do that in their mobile devices, we can, how important that will be for them recognizing what the beginning, middle, and end of an activity is. Okay, so when we start, I also talk about actually when you bring a child over to an activity, particularly if you're going to do an active reading story, or you're going to be working on something in their communication device. You might be actually teaching them some of the language and where it's located. You might be working on some syntax of some sort or some particular core words. All right. You need to alter the position of the student slightly. So even if, and this is what you need to plan. Speech therapists and teachers, you need to talk with your OTs and PTs about this and all be on the same page. So you may want to remove just one part of the chest harness. You may want to untilt them just 5 degrees so they're a little more upright. They may not be able to be all the way upright. It may be that the child cannot move forward in their seat, but if you folded a towel and you made it even just a flat surface and you slipped it, you undid their chest harness a little bit, and you slid it behind them, they now are not against the back of the chair. They're a little bit forward, because I could drop that towel down below their scapula, so they're slightly forward. Or I could add a bolster or piece of foam or a prop to assist in the altered position. So even when the body knows this prop is coming, they start to move forward. Even if the child cannot learn to do that moving forward, the body starts to recognize that they are prepared. All right, so I just talked about the neural pathway and working with other students. Okay, so when we start looking at the classroom itself, especially with adults, none of us were prepared in our education for how many adults in wheelchairs and additional equipment were going to be located in a traditional classroom space. If our traditional classroom space included lots of equipment, it would be about 2 or 3 times the size that it is. So I know we're always compromising. They're also a challenge for a location of technology. Honest to God, in Pennsylvania, why is that? Because we have schools that are old. So just finding enough electrical outlets and charging stations and where the smart board is going to be located, and then where are we going to have the computers located and our AAC devices, that already frequently limits how engaged our kids can be. And I understand that space around tables, where desks are going to go. I know that. But what I want to say is, I want you to understand that it is we are costing our children learning opportunities and the use of access for communication devices and their computers, which leads to being independent communicators and readers, future readers and future writers, by us not recognizing these are things we need to do. Okay, so I will say that I'm not going to go a whole lot into how I do this environmental use drawing. Essentially, what I do is I want you to figure out what parts of your day are used the most often. And I then do want you, all of us, if you haven't watched HGTV, you know somebody that does. And you know that as soon as you're talking about redecorating anything or open concept, we look at activity zones. And I want us to start recognizing we need to have equipment zones, and we need to, as therapists, help organize the physical configuration of those classrooms with the teachers, because that will prepare traffic patterns, which will prepare the development of cognitive mapping, which will prepare the understanding of navigation, which will prepare for the use of access cognitively. I want us to recognize also where all these additional adults are located throughout the day. Are they beside the student, behind the student, or near the student? And have you identified in each activity where that should be? Okay, instead of just allowing that individual to decide that. I want you to think about this. Okay, what accommodations are made? If I had my druthers, I'd have every adult body on a rolling stool. Or I would have a folding chair with a comfortable seat pad. And when the activity was done, that folding chair would be put aside. I want us to recognize that we are going to have no phone zones. Oh, so nobody's going to use a phone in this particular area. And we're going to have active engagement zones. So the paraprofessional in this active engagement zone is expected to be actively engaged, but in this no phone zone, they're to be there if needed. So they're going to be behind the student, but they can't be on their phone. Okay. So all of these things directly relate to how does that neuronal pathway develop of what is going to, how do I anticipate what's going to happen with this activity? All right, so let's look at some students and how we can start to associate this. I want you to meet a preschool girl who clearly is very tilted, okay? And what'll happen is if she started to be brought up right, and she's one of those kids, she has a dystonic cerebral palsy. And so what'll happen is she can get very excited and all of her limbs can go out, or she can be like a noodle, okay? Because she's under 3, all right? So if you bring her forward, her head just lies on her chest. So with her, when I talked about seating last time, I actually do put on this is a towel roll. It's not tied on, it's just a towel that's placed around her neck. I'll talk more about this in the next 2 weeks. We'll show this. But I brought her upright and I did release some of her chest harness so it was looser because I wanted to see what she's going to be able to do. But I want you to see how we're going to engage in activity. The speech therapist is going to read a story with her, and the speech therapist is going to be down. And everybody wasn't always asking her to be down because everybody was trying to hold a book above her here. Well, when you're in this position and your eye gaze is looking up and your body's in a contact of this surface, when your body's like this, the body doesn't expect to read or to be able to use your eyes very well. It's expecting to just rest, relax, and be entertained. I don't want entertainment. I want a child to have an opportunity to come upright. So the speech therapist is purposely placing herself on the floor and is going to read a book with this child. Okay, and we place the towel roll on just so the head would not fall all the way to the chest, but it's not itself strong enough to hold her up. But we're going to allow her to look at the storybook and expect her to. And as she does, we're not going to have a tray and we're not going to have it at a table because when she asserts any tone, it uses her whole body. So she's loving looking at this book. It happens to be an electronically controlled book that has some voices in it. She's trying to touch it. Okay. And so you can see how far she's got to reach down to do it. She wouldn't be able to have done that at all when she was in that overly tilted position. And what she then is doing is we're going to read the story and finish the story and read it again. And you can see her head is down, but she still is engaged. She's engaged. She's engaged. And she's actually now able to shift her position and still be engaged. And then when she was done, she was actually able to bring her head back. So although this was the first part of somebody saying, well, we really want her to have a communication device and we want to figure out access, this is what we first have to do. We first have to engage in activity. We have to look at how her body relates to that activity, what kind of postural mechanisms she's using, and then be able to assist her. So access is not what we look at identically first. But if we only worked with her here, we would never have seen that she could have done this. But we didn't expect her to do this without activity. We expected her to do that with activity. And I already, as the OT, had prepared that opportunity in terms of some positioning issues. Let's look at a middle school girl. Now, this was a girl that I met it from a workshop in Texas, and she was in middle school, and people wanted to know how could they mount the device high enough, because look where her eyes are looking. They couldn't get it high enough. They had trouble holding it there. The standard mounts weren't working. And they also felt that if she attempted to use a mechanical switch here with her wrist, that this telescoping mount would knock. Okay, and she had multiple contractures, shoulders, wrist, elbow. She had one hip dislocated. And what happened is that I wanted to meet her in an interesting environment when I was going to be working with her. So I asked that we be in the library in the middle school. And what I had to do there is I had to change positions. She also has a scoliosis, so she had a molded seat. My handling had to be minimal based on so many of her orthopedic anomalies. But I wanted to give her an opportunity to demonstrate how she could be upright. we can talk about this at a future date, but anyway, what is happening is now moving her switch access from her hand to her head. Not only are her eyes down, but she does not have to press these. These are zero pressure sensors in this headrest. And she not only could move the chair, which I first wanted her to do, so she could identify where she wanted to go in the library, she was actually able to drive this chair forward and make turns. But the point of the activity was for us to go pick out some books. When we did that, we actually were then able to take that same head array and use it with this chair and her communication device. And we found what pages she actually could navigate or not. She before had been using just single switch automatic scanning. And it was taking a long time. When she had 2 switch step scanning, it was clear to us what she could use or what she couldn't use, right? So again, when we're talking about out of chair instruction, okay, again, this is a teenage boy. Some of you may recognize Sue Gill and his teacher. And what will happen is we actually didn't have an alternative chair to put him in, but to bring him that far forward, but we were able to have the teacher sitting on a bench. And at first he had to sit with her, and then we were working to have him be on the bench next to her. But what happened is again, we brought him forward. Everybody was trying to present materials to him in this position, because when they bring him forward, his head would just flop over to the side. But when we brought him into a more weight-bearing position and offered some support, which our bodies can be the perfect chair. We can offer support or not support depending upon what we need. And what activity we're engaged in? We're engaged in an activity, a reading activity. And we're engaged in looking at core vocabulary so that we can set up something that then we can have him access. I want you to meet M. Okay, and M is somebody who I want you to understand that I got involved with her teams externally and her family over time. So this is when she was 5 years old, when she was first going to be in school, and we're looking at getting her high-low chair to get her experiences with having her feet on the floor. This is a kid walk. She actually could sit in this chair. She also could be at a real activity in this chair. Everybody was worried about access. At home, we're using an electronic sensor that doesn't require pressure. They're playing a game on the computer that they like. The mom is offering them this switch at the head, at her hand. She's helping her wherever she wants to do it, because we want her to learn what's happening at the computer. We don't care what's happening here. We want this just to be easy. We want her to, she knows this is what's making that work, but we want her to know what this is. So she's going to know what she's going after. So she knows, was that a motor mistake or a cognitive mistake? Okay, so then same thing, this headrest actually is holding 2 switches, so she could be using a computer in the classroom. She's in a high-low chair. She also was able, she loved riding horses, but we figured out how she could get into therapeutic riding. That's which she did. And she hated her school chair. It allowed me to help figure out then with her what parts she hated and how to get that working for her. And at the same time, she could be in the kid walk a lot of the day, where she had the best head control when she was more upright. Not very many walkers can kids stand to be in for very long. So we have to look at that. But what I want to say is kids can have head control now. We can be engaged in activities within that. I do want to tell you that M did decide 2 years later that she really wanted to use an eye gaze system. She tried some other things, but I have to tell you, she already knew all the vocabulary in there because people had been using a manual board and a notebook with her, including her mother and her teachers all along. So she'd been having that since she was 3 years old. So by the time she's 8 and we're choosing a device, she already knew the vocabulary. So when she had to just deal with an access method. But I wanted to also tell you, this is showing you Emma as she's getting older. She's a real big therapeutic rider. She also is a great winner. But I wanted to tell you, there she is with her blue ribbons. She does everything else other kids like to do. I loved it. This was her first dance and this was her first date. And do you believe it? When they went to take a picture, they didn't tell this young man to get down on his knees. It was something that he just did. I'm telling you, kids are great with other kids when we just we have inclusive activities. But she wanted to tell me, one of the things Em wanted me to show you was some of the pictures of her favorite activities that she's engaged in, that she can't use her eye gaze system at all. She's in cheer squad. She can't use it at therapeutic riding and she can't use it at cheer squad. Why? She can't see it outside. She can't have it just be 18 inches. You can't mount it there. So she has to have other methods that she's able to communicate with people when she's out of there, when we start looking at stuff. So we are never just looking at a device as an answer or one method. Okay, so that's just showing her in terms of cheering. Okay, so Oh, we have 3 minutes for questions. I really tried to hurry through. Let me just, are there any questions? Are there any questions, Tammy, that are pressing? If not, what I will do in these last 2 minutes is let me just back up to when I told you about analyzing. I will go over that little bit. Let's see where we are. Okay, here.
Hi, Karen. This is Tom Ellsworth. I just wanted to let you know Tammy's having a microphone issue, and she said there are no questions. So just wanted to pass that word along to you.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much. Okay, well, we have 2 minutes. You know me, I won't let any amount of time go loose. So when you're looking at the classroom, let me tell you how you actually can analyze your classroom. And this can be done by the OT, PT, teacher, teacher's aide. But what you're going to do is I want you to get a loose leaf notebook. And I want you to open it up with 2 loose leaves on either side. So it's open and you have a page on either side. And you're going to draw your classroom. Now, it doesn't have to be to spec that you've measured everything out, but you want to know where the doorway is, if you have a changing area in that room, where the teacher's desk is, where the smart board is, so that you can identify. And then I want you to look at where that multi-use table is, where your standing frame is. I want you to kind of look at that room, all right? And then when you have that, I want you to copy it. I want you to make 5 or 6 or 7 or 10 samples of it. And you're going to take a couple of days. You're going to ask either the OT or the PT or the speech therapist or the teacher. You're going to all agree for a couple of days, 5 times in that day, you are going to stop. So one of you is going to stop and you're going to mark in where all the kids are at that time. So you're going to mark in right after school starts, where everybody is. You're then going to look again, maybe at right before lunch. You're going to look at in the afternoon, and you can choose times, and you're going to fill in where is every student and where are all the paraprofessionals. So essentially we're gathering data on how are we using this space. Sorry, I'm having trouble hearing you. And that's what I call an environmental use drawing. That then allows us to look at how can we meet together as a team and start to figure out where would be some non-negotiable zones, how could we reorganize this classroom to help develop a traffic pattern that made sense for all that we have to do. I can't believe it. We're done. That hour just flies by. As usual, all of you who are watching, if you have a pressing question, please don't hesitate to email me. We have 2 more sessions. The next 2 times, we're going to be looking much more directly now at the access techniques utilized. And I'll be doing some show and tell with some electronic sensors and talking more directly about activities in that way. Thank you very much for